Hello, my name is Haley Mills. I'm the podcast producer of Integration Nation. I will be popping up in various ways this season as one of many changes for Season 3 of Integration Nation. In this episode, Allison is going to begin to unpack a concept called ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I will touch base with everybody afterwards to sum up what Allison has talked about and to give you a heads up on what to look forward to in the upcoming episodes as we expand on this idea.
Hi, I'm Allison Sullivan, a licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and you are listening to Integration Nation, a podcast to introduce you to and expand your knowledge about effective, integrative mental health concepts, practices, and approaches. So here we are in Season 3, and today we are going to start the series of episodes I referenced in our intro about internal intersectional identity, which is just a fancy way of saying, how a process for how we kind of make sense of our experiences, the different roles we find ourselves in across our lifetime, because our lives and our identity throughout our life is dynamic. It's not something that kind of gets locked in at birth and we ride that out until we cross over to the other side. It's something that's continually evolving. It's something that's continuing to develop. And what I have learned over the years is to the degree that we join with that, it really does influence our life satisfaction and our ability to navigate a course that seems really true to who we are and where we want to go in our life. And so if you want to know more about the specifics of how we're going to do this through Season 3, you're going to want to go back and listen to our little standalone intro. It's 5 or 10 minutes, not that long, and it really kind of describes how we're changing things up quite a bit this season. For our new listeners, we are happy you're here to check us out, and we hope you stay. This is going to be quite a ride for Season 3. And for our returning listeners, we are so honored that you are back with us. And I think it's ironic and actually super fitting that I'm taping the first episode by myself. It's a learning curve to learn how to do that. But I think that this episode is particularly important to do by myself because, at the end of the day, we are going to walk alongside, if we're lucky, some really cool people along our healing journey that are going to be able to support us and stand by us and give us encouragement when we need it. However, when it comes down to it, we are each living our own unique life. And so taping this first episode by myself and talking about the topic we're going to talk about today, I think is a great way to underscore how we are each on our own individual journey with this concept of identity and in our individual lives. And we invite others into our experience along the way. And the combination of being able to do that in a way that makes sense to who we are is a way that we can access deep belonging to ourselves and to others. So in the spirit of that, let's dive into our topic today. I want to first give content warning for people. We put that in the show notes as well, but I just want to give people an opportunity to know what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And we're going to talk about what those are, what the research says about those with identity development and mental and physical health challenges throughout the lifespan. And we're going to talk about this notion of counter ACEs that does help people develop resiliency. And so we're going to be including some dialogue about abuse, about sexual trauma, about neglect, and if that's something that based on your unique healing journey, where you are at this very moment, is not something that's going to be useful for you, then by all means, let's part ways for now. If you are in a place where that is something that is accessible to you now, then my hope after this opening episode is that you get a real understanding of a way to make sense of adverse childhood experiences, a framework to look at them, a lens, if you will, in your own life and how that may or may not have impacted identity development in your unique life. So let's start with a definition. I'm a big definition kind of gal because when we get really, definitions help us to get clear. And when we're clear on things, we can really navigate. And I'm a big definition person. And basically, ACEs are childhood experiences that kind of meet a threshold of trauma, a threshold of potential negative impact to the development of a child. There's categories of them, and there's been some significant research that indicates that children who experience these adverse childhood experiences in numbers of 4 or greater are at a somewhat higher risk for some health complications later in life, such as addiction, relationship issues, future abusive relationships, health challenges related to inflammation and autoimmune and chronic illnesses. And so it's really important to understand our relationship with ACEs and to figure out, after doing that, how we can kind of tap in to the resilience that is available to each of us. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of those categories of ACEs, and I'm going to use my own experience in a general way to talk about adverse childhood events as well as counter ACEs. And then we're going to close out the episode, as I referenced in our little intro, with a letter that I wrote to my little girl, my childhood self, as a way to kind of highlight how I began to make sense of and weave together these two parts of my life, my childhood and some adverse events that happened in my childhood, into my current life today. Some of the categories of these ACEs are the things that you might typically expect. Childhood abuse, whether that is emotional abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Additionally, childhood neglect. And what I'm referring to when I'm talking about childhood neglect is a really chronic state of neglect where the child in the home is just not being nurtured and cared for in any consistent way. As you might expect, poverty is considered an adverse childhood experience for a variety of reasons. It creates barriers to healthcare. It creates barriers to other support systems that are really vital for children when they're developing. It presents physical barriers and challenges, educational barriers and challenges. I mean, poverty is really a very dangerous experience for a child. Sometimes divorce can be considered an adverse childhood experience. And that's particularly true if there is a traumatic divorce and the children's lifestyle drastically diminishes as a result of the divorce. Substance abuse in the home where the child is being raised, if it is untreated, is an adverse childhood event, as is chronic untreated mental illness. The last two categories that we're going to highlight are parental incarceration. Being separated from a parent because of incarceration is one of those categories, and losing a parent as a child to death is understandably considered an ACE. What the research has said is that children who kind of have a stacking of these things really are, as it seems pretty self-evident, at an increased risk for mental and physical health challenges throughout their life. And in my own life, I did experience several of these. I grew up in a home that in many ways looked like your typical home. It looked like your typical family, especially in the 70s and in the 80s. However, I did grow up in a home that was emotionally and physically abusive, and I did experience sexual trauma as a child as well. There was also some substance use issues in my home, and so experiencing those events across time, as we'll unpack more throughout the season, did really have an impact on me in some really key ways. However, as we're about to discuss, there were some strengths that my family also had that really protected me from experiencing, some of the future risks to my health and development that could have occurred. But, in staying with these traumatic events for a minute, as I'm sure most of you can assume or conclude, those impacted my identity for a period in my life quite a bit. And in specific, those experiences really just impacted how I felt about myself, just my general worth. Why am I here and what's really the point? I mean, am I here to be mistreated in these ways? Am I here as a scapegoat? What exactly is the point? It really did take away any kind of framework where I could feel consistently valued for who I was in my family. And that's specifically important for identity development because we need to know not only in the families that we grow up in who we are connected to family members, but that we are valued and seen for who we are as a unique individual. And that aspect of my childhood was deeply impacted and injured because of the childhood events that I experienced. It also impacted me physically. I had some pretty chronic health conditions that began in childhood and that really stayed with me until my healing journey took me into that deeper layer of healing in middle adulthood. And really growing up in the home that I did with these experiences, just to kind of wrap up before we move into the other part of this episode, impacted my identity because I grew up thinking, okay, number one, I'm not really celebrated. Number two, I'm not safe. I'm just not safe. And number three, it confused in a couple of specific ways the notion of love and family. And it took quite a bit of healing to work through those things. Those three areas are really important to keep in mind as an example of how someone can move through this stuff when we start talking about what are counter ACEs. Okay, again, I love these labels because they're so self-explanatory. Counter ACEs are exactly what you might imagine, things that actually counteract these adverse childhood experiences. And recent research has really indicated that they can mitigate, they can really minimize and lessen the long-term impact of trauma in childhood. And that was certainly my case in a couple of key ways. As I talked about in season 2 with the lure of certainty when we were discussing about both and, that I think is at its core most true when I conceptualize and I integrate aspects of my identity, because it is very true that I had a very difficult childhood in some really foundation ways. And it is also true that there were some protective factors, some counter ACEs that really did mitigate some of the impact of that. Okay, so let's define what those counter ACEs are that help us develop resiliency or an ability to bounce back. Those are simple things like regular, predictable meals, friends, an adult to feel safe with, connections to school, connections to community, to sports, to a faith-based community, and even individual temperament of a person. Those categories can really lessen the harm that people experience with these traumas. And so in my own case, many of those aspects did exist in my life. On the outside, we lived a pretty typical middle-class experience. And so I had regular, predictable meals. I did have neighborhood friends that I had regular access to. And I think that really, across time, helped my sense of how to connect with other people, what was possible in families, what was possible in parenting, what was possible in loving and caring for each other. Access and exposure to those friends and those families really gave me a different lens to look at loving connection through. I also was connected to school from the perspective of I love to learn and I love to read, and reading was continually supported by my parents. Didn't matter how often I wanted to go to the library, how many books I wanted to get. that was continually supported in my family. And I also had a connection to sports. And I do believe that parts of my individual temperament, specifically my love of learning, really did help me survive long enough until I could learn to heal and thrive. And that's really the essence of resilience. The essence of resilience is not that we don't get knocked down, not that we don't struggle, but that we can access those inner resources that are within each of us, and we can lean into those to heal and to eventually learn how to thrive. In a nutshell, as it relates to this concept of identity development across time, I think a really important starting place for people to look is obviously in their childhood, and looking at childhood from this lens of aces and counter aces is a really clear way to get underneath some habits and perceptions and self-talk you may have and start to understand, okay, what were the things that worked against me in my childhood, and what were the things that maybe helped me, and how are those evident in my life today, or how do I need to care for that part of myself today to restore that, to integrate that, to repair that, wherever you are on your healing journey. And so one of the things I alluded to I didn't actually allude to it, I spelled it out pretty specifically in our intro to season 3, was one of the ways we're going to illustrate this is not only through guests this season and our mini episodes to talk about some of these processes of being able to more clearly integrate your sense of self across time, but we are also going to include letters throughout the season that I wrote to different parts of myself as a template to maybe clarify how you could begin to do this work within yourself. So it's about letter time, I'm thinking. And before we get going, I just want to give one more content warning to people who really aren't in a place where listening to general experiences of abuse and trauma. Time for you to just maybe turn off this episode and practice some self-care, and maybe review some of the other episodes from season 2 about empathy and self-care. And know that that's great. Anytime we make an intentional decision to care for ourselves, that's a win, and we are healing. So, for those of you who are sticking with it, this may be uncomfortable to hear. My hope is that in addition to it being uncomfortable, you can really see how specific I am about addressing the injuries, because that's what helps me to make sense of my stuck spots in my life today, is to be able to clearly know how I was injured then and how I can treat that in my life today. To that little girl who felt so unseen, so unheard, and so unsafe. Unsafe in her home, unsafe in her bed, afraid to move too much, speak too much, see too much. I say to you, I see you, and I value you. I believe everything you saw, everything you heard, everything you experienced, and everything you felt. When you were kicked down the hallway because you dropped a glass, I want you to know that it wasn't about you. It was about him. He was sick and in pain, and you were within reach and vulnerable because you were small and you needed him. I will protect you now because your innocence is your power. It is your strength. When you cried for help and she turned a deaf ear, I want you to know that I hear you and I am here. Come to me and I will hold you. I will rock you. I will brush your hair softly, gently, because your tender, sensitive heart deserves nurturing and understanding. It is how you help others learn to heal. When you were exploited by the men around you, charged with your protection, I want you to know that you are safe with me. You have control over access to and decisions about your body. Your body is beautiful exactly as it is, and I will nourish you inside and out with healthy food, exercise, care, and rest. It is the sacred vehicle that houses your brave spirit. When they made fun of you because you often knew the answer, and you finished the book, the assignment, the project first, I want you to know that I see your quick mind and your creativity. It is a bright light to shine the way for you and others. I value all of your ideas, perspectives, thoughts, and plans. When you were sick and alone, afraid because you didn't understand what was happening inside you and around you, I want you to know that I am paying attention to you now. I believe what you are feeling, and I take it seriously. I will continue to support you with medical care and with all of the oils and teas and thick socks, warm blankets, stories, and companionship that you need to know that you belong and are my priority, because even the strong need to not be strong all the time. And when you felt like the only way to get attention was by being perfect, quiet, helpful, agreeable, and self-sacrificing, I want you to know that it is safe for you to mess up, get it wrong, to fall short, to choose not to help, and to loudly disagree, because your value and your worth are not negotiable to me. It is as constant as the sun rising in the east. Thank you for your innocence, for your open heart, your tenacity, your determination, your bravery, and your spunk. Thank you for holding on until you found someone to listen to you, to guide you, and to support you. I am here and I can offer you that now. You are my priority, and I love and approve of you exactly as you are. Always present, always available. Yours truly, Allison.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Integration Nation. We're going to continue to explore and discuss with our guests throughout this season how adverse childhood events, risks, and protective factors in people's lives in general impact how a person develops and creates a sense of self, something that Allison has described in this episode as internal intersectional identity. Again, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Integration Nation by Allison Sullivan, licensed clinical social worker of downtown Fredericksburg, Virginia.